Okay, so go back to what you were saying about cultural socialism and wokeness, and but before I rudely interrupted you when you were talking about your
No, no, that's fine. That's what we're here for.
when you were talking about some of the research that you've been looking into, could you continue to elaborate on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of very well. I've done a number of large scale surveys in the U.S. and in the U.K. Let's say on culture war attitudes, and I've done surveys of academics as well. Looked at surveys of students. You see a number of things. I mean, one is that young people are just vastly more cultural socialist and woke than older people, even when you account for their political leanings. So a leftist over age 50 is just a lot more tolerant than a leftist under age 30. We've got data from the 1970s onwards in the US that asks, and we can show that an 18-year-old in the 70s, 80s, really right up until the early 2000s was more of a value relativist, more kind of a tolerant value relativist, but they have become much more of a moral absolutist, believing that there are fixed and absolute moral values, and also and this is around the identity questions. So, allowing a racist to speak in public, that's been asked since the early 70s in the U.S., and for a number of decades that went up, along with allowing a communist and a militarist to speak, and then this starts the racist one starts to diverge from the other 4 or 5 questions they asked, and that starts to take on more symbolic significance, along with sort of sexist speakers. And then, so already by the time we get into the 90s and 2000s, it's already starting to diverge. So I think we've actually got a longer standing. I mean, one of my arguments is actually what we're looking at is the outworking of a logic that begins in the 1960s, really. And spreads, and gradually the volume gets turned up and turned up and turned up. There's a book by Chris Rufo that argues that the radical ideas of the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground and some of these, Herbert Marcuse and others, those ideas have now become the dominant ideas in universities and spread into schools and businesses. And so, I mean, I don't take that view as much. My view is much more that what you had was this slow incremental evolution. You can see it in the legal rulings around affirmative action and around hostile environment and harassment law. All of this stuff just incrementally became more and more extreme in a way, and the way it was implemented in companies became more extreme gradually, not overnight just because of George Floyd, but actually you had this gradual evolution from sort of racial sensitivity to cancel culture. And similarly, in terms of something like the anti-racism taboo, Shelby Steele, African-American conservative writer, talks about this. This sort of spreads. It sort of starts out referring to a sort of smaller group of phenomena, and it spreads to encompass a wider and wider and wider features of daily life, and it spreads to also gender with sexism, and it spreads to homophobia and then transphobia. The consequences become greater and greater and greater. There's more cancellations. So I kind of think this is partly about ideas which were already there in the 60s, not necessarily cultural Marxist ideas, but just sort of liberal egalitarian ideas that become amplified over time through a process known as concept creep. So bullying, trauma, all these words start to mean not just real bullying, but actually feeling like somebody was mean to you. And so all of this kind of mission creep in these terms is part of this process that we've lived through. Now, yes, it's true that George Floyd, it's true that social media, and it's true that Donald Trump and these things accelerated some of these processes. But, and I think especially the fact that the media went from a classified ads model to a clickbait model, and you had more young people who were online coming in, and yeah, that all made a big difference. But fundamentally, the ideas are the same largely as they were in the late 60s.
So that's very interesting. So I mean, this generational divide has become a very important element of this discussion. I mean, it also leads me to think, I mean, who's really responsible then? Because presumably when we talk about the older generations being much more, in the more classical sense, and then the younger up and coming New York Times and publishing house staff are a lot less tolerant. Well, the older generations presumably raised the younger generations, and so why? I kind of wonder who's really responsible for that. I mean, you could argue that the within the institutions that had and the wider culture was shifting, and it was very difficult for people to change the tide. And you see that now with parents, when they find that there's particular materials in school, you kind of think, what do? Do you take your kid out of school? But I guess my question is, who is there a group of people? I don't know. Is it a cultural question? Is it a failure of political leaders? When we're questioning who contributed or what led to this change, is there any group that might be responsible?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one thing you see is that in academia, in academic papers, there was already a high level of discussion around racism, sexism, homophobia. It was becoming very dominant already in the 80s and 90s. What happens in the 2010s is this breaks into the media. That's really the big shift. And then it gets into young people partly through social media and pop culture, but also through schooling. So I think, yeah, the adults through pop culture, social media, schooling, perhaps advertising, are then responsible for transmitting this. I mean, the other thing, of course, they're transmitting is psychological fragility. Again, the expansion of the term bullying and trauma and emotional safety and all this stuff, this therapeutic language is growing within academia, and again, it has a burst through into the media and where it reaches younger people. And of course, younger people who are much more likely to say that they're anxious or depressed than older people. And if you say that I'm anxious or depressed all the time, you are much more likely to say Britain is a racist country, I've experienced racism or sexism or whatever. And so there's a relationship between mental health declining and wokeness. And I think it runs not through young people not being allowed to play outside, as Jonathan Haidt would argue. I think it's much more that this sort of bloated mission creep in therapeutic terms that was already current in academia from the 80s and 90s breaks through into the mass culture in the 2010s. And that is really what kind of sensitizes, radicalizes a significant number of young people. I should say that there is an increasing gender divide amongst young people. Younger men are a lot less woke than younger women. There's not a big racial divide, actually. In Britain, for example, young minorities are less woke than young whites. But there's a big divide on sexuality and a big divide on gender. So it's kind of, that's how I would read the change. But I also think probably there's more polarization now in that young population. Yes, on gender lines, but also increasingly on which media sites that they visit. And I would expect this to become a bigger and bigger political issue as that young generation becomes the median voter.